But this is the first article, the first headline here. Putin says Russia is ready to talk Ukraine. This is a story just came posted this morning, and I'll just read the first couple of sentences here. It says Moscow. President Vladimir Putin said on Tuesday that Russia would be prepared to talk to Ukraine, the United States, and Europe about the future of Ukraine if they wanted to, but Moscow would defend its national interests. Putin, who sent troops into Ukraine in 2022, has repeatedly said he would be prepared to talk about peace, though Western officials say he is waiting for the U.S. presidential election in November before making a genuine effort. Would you say he's waiting for that? Now, if we were to believe this reporting, would you say he's waiting to make a deal because he doesn't want to make a deal with this president who may not be there later? Or do you even buy this this sort of story or this reporting, Danny? What say you about what Putin being willing to negotiate or at least begin talks about? I guess it would be ending this war. One, had you heard about this, and what are your thoughts on if this is true?
Well, this is a talking point that's come up periodically over the course of the conflict, and especially after the scuttled peace deal of March, April 2022. It's come up periodically. Now it's coming up again as a way to change the narrative about the conflict. I know that you both have been seeing how the Western mainstream media, how the U.S. and European, the NATO establishment, how they are now talking about this conflict differently. They're trying to portray this conflict as now in a state of freeze, as one that is characterized by stalemate. And unfortunately, we have many people who don't know what a stalemate means. Basically, that means that there is no progress on either side, and that this means that there is no winner, there is no loser, that there is simply a static situation, which, could lend itself to any number of outcomes in the future. But what it portrays, even just using the word, is it portrays a situation where Ukraine is allowed to have failed in some regards, but succeeded in others. And this is really a matter of public relations, where the U.S. and NATO are trying to create an image of Ukraine where it was an upstart, odds beater, like a David against Goliath kind of thing, where it wasn't able to defeat Goliath, but at the very least it was able to freeze the hostilities with Goliath. And guess what? It's because we supported Ukraine so much. And this helps give room to some of the realities of, well, Ukraine isn't actually able to make any more progress. The United States and many NATO member countries are very hesitant to give more to Ukraine at this moment, given that there is no prospects for achieving the initial objective. So if we can erase the fact that this was always a war against Russia, that it was always meant to try to undermine and hopefully ensure that Russia crumbles politically, economically, and militarily, we can get rid of any notion that that was the real goal, then maybe we can salvage this conflict. We can pause it so that there can be a reorientation, not only of the military situation, but really of the entire strategic vision, the strategic goal of the United States and of NATO, which is to undermine Russia. They need time to figure out how to do that again, now that what really has happened is a strategic defeat. NATO was strategically defeated by Russia. Russia was able to curb what was a provocative proxy war against it. It solidified its economic base and even has done better than prior to the conflict in many respects economically. Militarily, it does not have the disadvantages that Ukraine has now, or NATO, or the United States, for that matter. It has manpower. It has the ability to fight this war at this level for quite a long time without sustaining any real damage politically, militarily, or economically. So what NATO actually achieved with strategic defeat for itself. And so it's trying to reorient the narrative. And one good way to do that is to make it look as if Vladimir Putin and Russia is the one that has to respond to some kind of stalemate situation. For example, with negotiations. I don't believe Russia wants to negotiate one bit right now with the United States. And I don't think it matters. And this is, I think, the hubris and the arrogance of the US elite. They believe that Russia cares about who is actually in office in the United States. I don't believe that Vladimir Putin actually cares. I don't believe that if Donald Trump were to win in November, that would mean he's going to call up Donald Trump and say, hey, you want to negotiate peace. The fact is that Russia doesn't have to negotiate right now because its objectives are actually well on their way toward being met. Russia has actually neutralized, in many respects, the ability for Ukraine to join NATO. You hear it all the time now. Oh, Ukraine will eventually join NATO, but it's a little too corrupt. It's a little too, that might start war with Russia. Well, guess what that's an admission of? It means that Russia actually prevented Ukraine's eventual membership through this conflict, through its ability to essentially stand up to NATO's military prowess and expose it for what it was, which was a paper tiger. So, and the problem of the Banderites and the neo-Nazis and these forces, that has been all the well curbed in many respects. Ukraine's army is a shell of what it once was. And it's only going to get worse for them. Now there's a conscription crisis along with the weapons and ammunition and all in that entire crisis. And there's also a growing political crisis in Ukraine, which was inevitable given that it was already a poor country that's only getting poorer and that's only becoming more unstable. It's losing its literal lifeline without the United States' complete and unconditional support at a large level. A lot of Ukraine's society, civil society, its economy is going to crumble because, like most puppet states, the United States requires a huge amount of dependency on it in order to exist. And so without that aid, Ukraine's government itself, as it is currently constructed, is actually under threat of existing at all. And so that is, I think, what this story is trying to cover for. Russia and Vladimir Putin, they want to negotiate this. I mean, this is something they've been talking about since the beginning of the conflict, since before the conflict began. This is what was actually attempting to, what Russia was attempting to do in December of 2021. They tried to talk to NATO. They tried to talk to the United States. And they got the middle finger, essentially. And Russia did negotiate a peace agreement in spring of 2022, which the United States and the UK and I think Ukraine as well. A lot of people like to say, oh, well, they made Ukraine not do it. I don't believe Ukraine's leadership wanted to sign a peace agreement. I think they were just waiting for the red light, for the green light from the United States and NATO to scuttle it. So the fact is that Russia has always wanted to negotiate some kind of settlement to this. Russia has made it very clear that they're not here to expand themselves. They're not here to move further than protecting the Donbass and ensuring Crimea remains a part of Russia. That their goals are very clear and that they have nothing to do with moving this conflict beyond Ukraine or even beyond the territories which Russia committed to defending, those that Ukraine was shelling and mass murdering people of Russian descent for years and years prior to February 2022. So the reality is that Russia doesn't have to negotiate. Russia doesn't really care who's in office in the United States, but Russia does have a desire to come to a political agreement and settlement that is fair. And so if there is political leadership in the United States that is willing to do that, and in Europe as well, it's willing to do that, then Russia will certainly take it on and will negotiate as it did during the Minsk Accords when that occurred in 2013, 14, 15. But at the same time, because of what happened to that so-called ceasefire agreement with NATO completely violating it by arming Ukraine to the teeth in order to prepare for this conflict, Russia doesn't have any reason to trust the United States or Europe right now. And until it does, it's not going to come to the table when there's nothing pressuring it to do so. The United States, mainstream media, the West and its mainstream media, they want us to believe that Russia has some reason to do this, because they want us to believe that 87% of Russia's military has been taken out
Yeah.
during this conflict. That's what U.S. intelligence wants us to believe. Yet, Putin himself,
So
regardless of whether you
ridiculous.
think it's propaganda or not, he said, well, we have hundreds of thousands waiting to come. We have 1,500 a week joining in order to go to the front lines. And guess what? We don't have to use most of them. So the realities of war are a lot different than how the Western mainstream media want us to believe them to be. And the fact is that Russia, sure, Putin wants to negotiate, but it's not contingent on Trump or Biden or anything else other than Russia's political objectives.
Did you see on Russia TV? Is it RT? It says Russia isn't going to war with NATO, and that is from Putin. And I'm going to play it in just a second. But this is a quote. It says, U.S. leadership says that if Russia wins in Ukraine, NATO countries will be next. But why do we need NATO countries? We don't, end quote. And that's Russian President Vladimir Zelensky. Yeah, go ahead, Nick, if you're going to.
Yeah, and Putin is saying this because there's been a psyop, because there's been a fall of support in the Ukraine war, because they are having a hard time convincing European working class people who are paying more for energy, and American working class people who are struggling as well, why this issue is so important. So they've been making up unhinged conspiracy theories, and I see you smirking, Danny, because I know you've seen them as well, where they completely rewrote the goals of Russia. Because we all know that Russia is protecting their sovereignty. They don't want NATO encroachment. And that's one of the reasons why they started this war. Now, what they're saying is that Putin is on he randomly woke up one day, CJ. He snapped, and all of a sudden he decided he want to take over Europe. So now they're saying that if they don't stop Putin in Ukraine, Putin to go and take over Europe, which is very interesting, because they claim that Russia is a weak country that who can't defeat Ukraine, right? So it's funny how they're fearing a country that is weak, who's losing to Ukraine based on their narrative, but at the same time they still the idea that they're gonna take over Europe. Danny, you want to chime in on CJ? I know you
yeah.
Get to that clip.
I just playing a couple of clips from Danny, but I'll let him chime in on what the quotes from Putin about him not wanting any other NATO country. What are your thoughts, or how do you reflect on that?
Well, I mean, you all say this all the time, and it's entirely true that the United States, that NATO, they're constantly projecting their own interests onto those that they target, because they need global public opinion, and they especially need Western public opinion to believe that there is something scarier than them. They need that, because without that, how could NATO, how could the United States present themselves as forces for good, or forces for peace, or forces for stability, or would they name this operation with regard to Yemen Prosperity Guardian, to look like they're the ones who are guarding prosperity rather than destroying it and absolutely lighting it ablaze, right? They have to look like that they're the ones who are protecting the world from someone like Putin. The problem with Putin and Russia right now is that we've had 2 years now of an open conflict, a proxy war that has taken on the character of a World War I style conflict. That's not a good thing for NATO. That wasn't a good thing. That this wasn't how it was supposed to go. Russia was supposed to fall apart after a couple months of sanctions, a couple of months of fighting, and Russia was supposed to be on its knees with a domestic insurgency, with people in Russia furious at Putin, furious at Russia, at the Russian government for allowing the population to become so poor and for it to live in squalor as they fight some unjust war against the plucky, downtrodden Ukrainian Nazis. Like that's how it was supposed to go. And then NATO would come in and say, "Oh, well, now we can talk to you from a position of power. Now Russia is certainly a subordinate, and now it has to talk to us about our security interests, not theirs." And so that was how the United States and how NATO envisioned this going when they made the really just, I think, misguided calculation that escalating what was a kind of kinetic proxy war in Ukraine against Russia to launch it into what it became, which was really an attempt to turn a proxy war into a full frontal conflict with a superpower, with an emerging superpower. It was a huge miscalculation that has led to a 2-year period. Now we're heading into year number 2 as of this February, where it has been so obvious that Russia is not attempting to overthrow Kiev or expand the theater of war beyond the territories which were always in question, the Donbass, Crimea, etc. None of the conflict, none of the fighting has expanded beyond that defensive or offensive line, however you want to look at this conflict. And so by the Dnieper River, it hasn't moved beyond that. And it's not as if Russia doesn't have the capabilities. Russia has nuclear weapons. Russia has more nuclear weapons than the United States. Russia could try to leverage its nuclear power in order to force submission. But of course, Russia knows full well, if it were to ever do such a thing, NATO is the actual one that's unhinged. And you might actually have a nuclear war on your hands because you can't trust those forces that control the levers of NATO's military branch. You just in its arsenal, you just can't trust them. So the fact is that Russia never had any interest in NATO. First of all, Russia doesn't view NATO as a legitimate political and military force in the region. It just doesn't. It doesn't have the right to do what it is doing. Its existence is completely and utterly irrelevant. It has outlived its purpose. Its purpose, which I always believe was also illegitimate, was to defend Europe from the Soviet Union. That's BS in and of itself. It was really to try to erase the influence of socialism and the socialist bloc on the entire region. It was an attempt to really cement the forces of capital and fascism in many ways in that region so that the United States would be able to grow into this superpower role and use Europe as a springboard for that. That was all what NATO was about. So that makes its purpose even more legitimate historically. But even now, if you look at post-1991, post-Soviet Union, NATO's entire reason for existing has completely been erased from relevancy, meaning that Russia does not view NATO as a legitimate force in the region. And why should it? So why should it even view the regional situation that surrounds it, and even the larger global situation, as one that includes some kind of plot against NATO? Russia wants good relations with its neighbors. Russia does not want to be in conflict with a NATO state or non-NATO state, but it certainly is not making calculations on this. Joe Biden, in a desperate attempt to get aid, this is what it really is all about. They're trying to get aid. Joe Biden said it during the presser as Congress was getting ready to reject the $60+ billion of package that included Israeli aid, and most of it was going to go to Ukraine. As they were getting ready to reject that, Joe Biden went on the mantle and said, please, please don't reject it. Putin is so bad. Putin is so bad. The problem is that we've now had 2 years that have shown Russia has not expanded the theater of conflict, and that Russia does not have any interest in fighting with NATO or even recognizing NATO as a legitimate bloc. Really, what Russia wants is good relationships with its neighbors, and it wants the ending of a long decades-long process of encirclement. That's what Russia wants to end. That's what it wants to see end. It wants to see this creeping toward the Russian border with NATO military installations via increasing NATO membership to former Soviet republics like Estonia, like Latvia, like Lithuania. It wants to see these kind of moves end. Ukraine was a red line because Ukraine was really the last of it. I mean, there really is not much left in the Baltic region, in that region of Eastern Europe, that would protect Russia from the possibility of being fully encircled. So that's why Ukraine was the red line. And that's why Russia was so committed to ensuring that it, righted some wrongs. It was wrong to not protect the republics in a more, I think, powerful way in the 2014-15 referendums, when those republics said we want to be independent, Donetsk, Lugansk. That's when it started. It should have probably done that, and Putin has admitted that. So we made a mistake. We probably should have supported them when conditions were better. But Russia said, okay, let's play the diplomatic game. Let's look the part and actually play the part of a diplomatic country, as one that is willing to negotiate with other countries around a very important issue. They got it wrong. Russia was wrong to do that. That's where Russia was wrong. It wasn't this conflict or anything. Russia was wrong to not have trusted, to have been too trustful of those forces that have a long record of having absolutely no reason to trust them, that they are always looking to to destroy, to destabilize. They don't have any interest in respecting Russia's security interests, its sovereignty, or really the sovereignty of anyone for that matter. What they care about is what the objectives of the Ukraine conflict was: military profiteering and the larger military strategic policy of encirclement of Russia and the ultimate containment and destruction of Russia to fulfill the Wolfowitz doctrine, so to speak.